The survey party reached the canyon rim on the 14th of October 1899, 6 men carrying 300 pounds of core drilling equipment. The Colorado State Bureau of Mines had contracted from a Denver firm the previous spring. Their assignment was standard for the era: assess the subsurface geology of a remote section of Mesa country in the southwestern corner of the state, ground the Bureau had flagged as a possible extension of the silver-bearing formations that had made the San Juan Mountains valuable 2 decades earlier, and that the silver panic of 1893 had since rendered economically dormant without closing off the possibility of new yields in adjacent terrain. The crew foreman, Aldous Creighton, had worked similar contracts across the Front Range and the western slope, and recorded nothing in the terrain ahead to suggest this particular site would produce anything the Bureau had not already catalogued. The mesa sat at roughly 8,000 feet, flat across its upper surface, with near-vertical sandstone walls dropping several hundred feet into a dry tributary of the Dolores River below. Creighton's field notes from the first 3 days describe the routine progress of a standard geological survey: soil samples collected and bagged by depth interval, surface formations mapped against the Bureau's existing regional charts, the portable drill rig assembled on the mesa's northern shelf, where the bedrock exposure was thinnest and the overburden above it most accessible for coring. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. On the 4th day, at a depth Creighton's field log recorded as 14 feet and 3 inches below the surface contact, the drill stopped. Not the way a bit stops when it meets hard quartzite or a dense mineral seam, where resistance builds gradually and the operator feels the formation slow the rod against a familiar kind of pushback. It stopped flat, the way a bit stops when it meets constructed surface rather than natural formation, a clean horizontal resistance that the driller, a man who appears in the Denver firm's equipment rental ledger only as W. Holt, described afterward as striking a floor. Holt had run core operations across 3 states over 12 years of subsurface work. He told Creighton that the sensation through the rod had no precedent in his experience. The bit had passed through 14 feet of ordinary sedimentary deposit and then contacted something that ran horizontal and would not yield. Creighton ordered the rig stopped. He called a second borehole, 6 feet to the north, and the results matched. The same flat contact at the same depth, with less than 3 inches of variance across the 2 points. A third bore, 8 feet to the east, found the same resistance at 14 feet and 1 inch. 3 boreholes, 3 contacts. The same flat surface running beneath the sediment in a pattern that bedrock formation does not produce, and that a survey foreman with Creighton's experience had no geological category to explain. The assayer arrived on the 7th day. His name was Thomas Markel, and he had worked out of Durango for 11 years, long enough to have assessed core samples from the silver operations at Silverton and the gold runs near Telluride, long enough to know the difference between a sedimentary contact that produces unexpected resistance and one that produces unexpected material. What Creighton's collection showed him was not what either man had anticipated. The cores pulled from above the contact were sedimentary material consistent with what the surface geology predicted: sandstone and compressed clay, undisturbed across all 14 feet in the way undisturbed sediment presents when it has not been excavated, moved or compacted by anything other than its own slow accumulation over time. The material pulled from below the contact, extracted through percussion borings Creighton had ordered on the evening of the 4th day, was different in kind rather than degree. The lower cores showed dressed stone, a fine-grained grey limestone cut, with a flatness that sedimentary formation does not achieve on its own, and that no geological process Markel had encountered in 11 years of Colorado mineral work could account for. He took measurements. He examined the cut face with a hand lens and noted the tool marks the face carried. He measured the width of the cut at 4 separate points and compared the variance. The cut ran within 2 millimeters of true flat across the full width of the core sample, a tolerance that hand-worked stone rarely achieves by accident and that natural geological process does not achieve at all. By the afternoon of the 8th day, he had packed his kit and told Creighton he was returning to Durango. The survey record shows no formal resignation entry from Markel, only a blank where his initials should appear beginning on the 9th day of the crew's time on site and continuing through the survey's completion. What he said to Creighton that afternoon was not recorded by Creighton at the time. It was recorded by someone else, 17 years later. A man named Ellsworth Peabody served as a contract cartographer for the Bureau of Land Management in the southwestern Colorado district from 1911 to 1923. He kept field notebooks rather than filing formal reports, and those notebooks passed through several private hands before a portion of them were donated to the Colorado Historical Society's archive in the 1970s, where they sit indexed under General Land Survey correspondence and have attracted limited scholarly attention from historians of the Mesa country extraction period. In a passage dated 1916, Peabody recorded a conversation with Markel, who was by then retired and living in Farmington, New Mexico. Markel told him that what he had examined in Creighton's core samples was dressed limestone, cut to a flatness achievable only by hand tool work, and that the cut face showed marks consistent with interior-grade stone preparation rather than exterior walling. A surface prepared to face inward, to be seen and walked above, not to bear ground pressure from outside. He told Peabody that he had recognized what he was looking at and understood immediately what it meant for the federal contract Creighton was running. A survey authorized to locate mineral deposits did not carry the legal standing in 1899 to excavate a structure of pre-Columbian origin. Markel had no interest in being present when the Bureau discovered it had spent a week drilling through the ceiling of something that should have been reported to a different office entirely. He had spent the morning with a hand lens and a measuring tape confirming what he already suspected from the first sample he pulled from the bag. By noon he had reached his conclusion. By mid-afternoon he was packed. He was right about the institutional problem at least. Creighton filed the survey with the Bureau in November of 1899. The entry for the Mesa site logged the surface formations, noted the subsurface contact, and classified the finding as an anomalous geological feature pending further review. The Bureau did not authorize further review. The file was not referred to any other agency. It sat in the anomalous category alongside other incomplete surveys and was not revisited. No federal archaeological assessment of that specific Mesa section appears in the record for the following 50 years. By the time anyone with an archaeological mandate had reason to look systematically at the southwestern Colorado Mesa country, the landmarks Creighton had used to fix his borehole positions had been altered by decades of erosion, stock grazing, and routine range management conducted with no knowledge of what it was working across. The Bureau's budget records for 1900 show no allocation for a follow-up survey of the Mesa site. By 1901, the file had moved from active to pending. By 1905, it had been reclassified. Closed. Resource assessment complete. Negative result. That reclassification occurred under a Bureau administration that changed leadership twice between 1899 and 1905. The internal correspondence covering southwestern Colorado surveys from 1896 to 1904 was transferred to federal storage in 1932. The portion covering that span was listed as damaged beyond recovery in the 1964 inventory of those materials without specification of what caused the damage or which parcels the missing correspondence had covered. The legal framework that would have changed the outcome of all of this did not exist in 1899. Congress passed the Antiquities Act in 1906, 7 years after Creighton's survey crew packed their rig and rode off the Mesa. Under the Act's provisions, a find of the kind Creighton's boreholes suggested would have carried formal reporting obligations to the federal government and would have prohibited excavation without a permit. The Act was passed in direct response to the unregulated looting and destruction of ancestral Puebloan sites across the Four Corners region that had accelerated through the 1880s and 90s, the same period during which the Bureau's survey crews were working the same Mesa country, and the same period during which Bureau of American Ethnology field researchers were collecting Ute oral tradition about layered terrain from informants whose knowledge of what that terrain contained had outlasted several generations of outside contact. The timing between those events is not a coincidence requiring explanation. It is simply the record of how institutional frameworks respond to problems they have already allowed to develop for years. The tradition the Ute people maintained about the Mesa country in the southwestern corner of Colorado predates the 1899 survey by a span the oral record does not fix with precision, and describing it accurately requires holding two things at once. The oral record is specific in what it contains. The oral record was not produced to answer the questions later researchers brought to it. Those are not the same kind of specificity, and collapsing them into one has done more to discredit indigenous testimony in the academic literature than any amount of genuine evidential weakness ever managed on its own. The Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute communities preserved accounts of the Mesa country as terrain with layers, not in the loosely metaphorical sense that phrase sometimes carries in popular writing about indigenous tradition, but as a physical description of a landscape where what the eye encounters at the surface sits above older human occupation as much as older geological strata. These accounts do not name a specific entrance point or provide a cartographic location. What they describe across versions collected by Bureau of American Ethnology field researchers who worked in the southwestern Colorado region during the 1880s and 90s is a set of consistent principles about certain mesa tops. That they were not empty of prior human presence when the Ute arrived in the region, that the emptiness visible at the surface did not correspond to the situation below it, and that certain plateau formations carried a weight of prior occupation the Ute recognized as requiring particular regard from those who came after. The consistency of that description across separate collection efforts, conducted by different researchers working from different institutional bases at different points within the same general decade, is itself a feature of the record the academic literature has not addressed in any sustained way. Oral traditions that describe specific physical properties of a landscape as opposed to its spiritual significance or its place in a cosmological narrative tend to be more resistant to drift across generations of retelling precisely because their content is verifiable to the people transmitting them. A tradition that says the ground of a certain mesa sounds different when struck is either right or it is not, and the people repeating it know the difference. A tradition that says certain mesa formations sit above something that was placed there deliberately belongs to the category of claim that could be checked, at least in principle, by anyone willing to ask the right questions of the terrain itself. Bureau of American Ethnology field notebooks from the southwestern Colorado survey period, portions of which passed into the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives through the standard institutional route of the era, contain entries from conversations with Southern Ute informants that have received almost no attention outside a narrow circle of specialist historians. Those entries describe the Mesa country in terms that the field researchers recorded as sacred designation, a shorthand that covered a range of distinctions the informants were making more precisely. What those informants described, as it appears in the archived pages, was a landscape where former occupants had gone into the ground rather than away from it, where the departure from the surface had been deliberate rather than forced, and where the layer below remained occupied in a sense the Ute recognized without treating it as theirs to open. The field researchers who collected these accounts in the early 1890s did not publish them in any study that subsequently entered wide circulation. The accounts were filed and archived in the ordinary way that field materials were handled by the Bureau in that period, indexed, accessible in principle, and practically invisible to anyone who did not already have specific reason to look for them. The Bureau's published output from the southwestern Colorado survey period concentrated on material that could be connected to documented archaeological sites. What the Ute informants described about the Mesa country between those named sites was a kind of knowledge the published record had no shelf for. 17 years later, Creighton's drill rig would find a flat limestone surface at 14 feet in the same general Mesa country, and no one who might have connected those two records was in a position to know that both of them existed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Juan de Rivera expedition entered the Colorado Plateau country in 1765, the first documented Spanish party to penetrate this portion of the region. Rivera's assignment was to locate a reliable route to Ute country and verify reports of mineral wealth that had filtered south through trade networks and the intermittent accounts of men whose information the colonial government in Santa Fe trusted enough to act on without publishing. Rivera's journal, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville and partially transcribed by the historian Ted J. Warner in the 1976 scholarly edition of the Dominguez Escalante expedition documents, describes the Mesa country along the Upper Dolores watershed as a landscape his Ute guides treated with a deference that Rivera noted and did not account for. The party traveled around certain mesa tops rather than across them. The guides declined to camp within what Rivera estimated as a half-league of certain plateau edges. When he asked the reason, his interpreter recorded the answer as a statement that what sat above the ground on those mesas was less significant than what the ground sat above. Rivera did not investigate. His mandate was cartographic and diplomatic, and he had no reason to spend time on ground his guides were unwilling to approach closely. The mineral wealth the colonial administration had sent him to verify was never located during this expedition, and his report back to Santa Fe recommended further surveys without specifying where they should concentrate. But his journal places the same Ute practice around the same general Mesa country more than a century before sustained American presence in the region. The behavior Creighton's crew was never told about when they assembled their drill rig in October of 1899 had been observed and recorded by at least one outside source before anyone in the Bureau's Denver offices was thinking about the southwestern slope as a viable target for mineral assessment. The gap between Rivera's journal entry and Creighton's borehole log is 134 years. The Ute guide's behavior in both accounts is the same. 11 years after Rivera, the Dominguez Escalante expedition passed through the same general region on its search for a northern route between Santa Fe and the California missions. Father Escalante's journals, among the most detailed 18th century accounts of the southern Colorado Plateau from a European perspective, record consistently that the Ute maintained specific practices around elevated terrain throughout this portion of the route. Certain mesa formations were not traversed directly, were not used as campsites, and were described in terms Escalante interpreted as sacred designation without pressing further into what that designation covered. Sacred designation and structural awareness do not describe the same thing. A formation whose properties above a sealed subterranean chamber, the way sound travels differently over hollow ground than over solid bedrock, the way certain surfaces carry a particular quality of vibration that compact stone does not, had been understood through generations of careful occupation, would produce exactly those practices in a people who knew what the ground meant without needing to explain it to an expedition passing through and unlikely to return. Escalante's observation is not an explanation of the Mesa country's subsurface condition. It is a record of behavior that becomes considerably more legible when placed beside a borehole log from 1899 and a retired assayer's conversation in Farmington in 1916. What sits directly beside this body of oral and expedition record is the physical evidence of the ancestral Puebloan occupation of the same Mesa country, a record the archaeological consensus assembled across the 20th century without satisfactorily accounting for one of its structural features. The people who built at Mesa Verde, at Hovenweep, across the canyon systems of what is now the Four Corners region, did not build exclusively at the surface. Their construction extended below grade as well as outward. The kiva, the circular subterranean ceremonial chamber that runs through the entire ancestral Puebloan architectural tradition from its earliest documented phases, was built below the surrounding ground level, entered from above through an opening in its roof, and sealed with a flat cap of stone and heavy timber that sat at or near the surrounding surface. The Great Kiva, a ceremonial form on a scale significantly larger than the domestic version, could span 40 to 60 feet in interior diameter. Its roof, built in the period's standard method, was a heavy platform of stone and timber, capable of bearing centuries of sedimentary accumulation if the structure was sealed at abandonment rather than dismantled for its materials. The evidence for this specific construction behavior is not speculative. It is documented at excavated sites from one end of the Four Corners region to the other. 14 feet of sedimentary deposit is not unusual over a span of 7 centuries, which is roughly the gap between the latest documented ancestral Pueblo and occupation dates in the southwestern Colorado Mesa country and October of 1899. A drill bit passing through 14 feet of sedimentary fill and contacting a flat, tool-worked limestone cap at a consistent depth across 3 boreholes in a linear arrangement is consistent with the upper surface of exactly that kind of structure. The stone Markel identified, fine-grained gray limestone, is consistent with the material documented at Great Kiva construction sites throughout the Chaco system's northwestern reach, a reach that extends into the Colorado Plateau country in ways the consensus has documented at confirmed and excavated sites and has not fully mapped across the mesa formations lying between them. The Chaco system's outlier network connected communities across a territory considerably larger than the canyon center itself, through road segments, signal features, and great house structures whose full extent continues to be revised as remote sensing technology improves. The architectural logic of that network, including the placement of Great Kiva structures at the centers of outlying communities, followed spatial principles consistent enough across the region that predictive distribution in unexcavated mesa terrain is plausible from the spacing patterns documented at confirmed sites. A researcher working from the existing distribution of documented Chaco outliers in the Four Corners region and extending that distribution across the mesa formations to the northwest would find that the section Creighton's crew surveyed in the autumn of 1899 falls within the spatial range where an outlier community would be expected, based on the spacing patterns documented at confirmed sites. The mesa's elevation, drainage position relative to the Dolores watershed, and proximity to the general network corridor are all consistent with the locational logic the Chaco system followed elsewhere. That is not confirmation. It is a specific and articulable reason to look, of the kind that has generated excavation permits at comparable locations across the region when the parcel in question had an institutional advocate willing to submit the application. No formal proposal connected to this parcel has ever drawn on it. The question the 1899 survey record leaves most sharply open is what happened to the physical evidence. Creighton's field log lists the lower core samples as collected and bagged. His final report lists them as transported to Denver with the rest of the survey material. The Denver firm's equipment return log, held in a partial archive at the Colorado Historical Society, lists the core cases as received. No subsequent record of the lower core samples from the Mesa site appears in the Bureau's holdings, the Denver firm's inventory, or any university or museum collection that the partial paper trail has been traced against. Core samples are not perishable. They are heavy, standardized, carefully labeled geological material with no commercial value and no ordinary reason to be discarded after receipt. The absence of the Mesa site's lower cores from any traceable collection is not an administrative oversight, the surviving record explains. It is a location the record has left blank, and blank locations in an otherwise continuous paper trail do not typically produce themselves without a decision somewhere in the chain. Markel told Peabody one additional thing that the 1916 notebook entry does not elaborate on further. After leaving the survey site, he had written a private letter to a contact at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, a geologist whose name Markel gave to Peabody, but that Peabody recorded only as the professor at the school. The letter described what he had examined and requested a professional opinion on whether dressed grey limestone of the kind he had documented was consistent with ancestral Pueblo and construction materials from the Four Corners region. He received no reply. He wrote a second letter 2 months later. He received no reply to that one either. Whether those letters arrived and were set aside, were lost in transit, or were received by someone who saw no institutional benefit in following up on an assayer's private inquiry about a site the Bureau had already closed as a negative result, the record cannot say. The Colorado School of Mines archive has not been searched for Markel's correspondence in any documented study. What Markel carried in the decades that followed was the professional opinion of a man who had looked at a thing with his own hand lens and knew what the evidence meant, and who had written that conclusion down twice for someone who never replied, and then held it for 30 years before a cartographer with a notebook gave him a reason to say it aloud. The Mesa sits today within a federal land management unit that does not publish specific parcel-level survey histories in publicly accessible databases. The Dolores River watershed, the terrain Rivera's guides avoided, and Escalante's expedition skirted without full explanation, continues to be managed primarily as grazing and conservation land. No site-specific archaeological assessment for the parcel Creighton's crew worked in October of 1899 appears in any public record. The National Register of Historic Places shows no listings for that section of Mesa country. No excavation permit application for that ground appears in the public record. No ground-penetrating radar study has been published covering it. The Peabody Notebook entry on Markel sits in the Colorado Historical Society's archive alongside thousands of other pages of survey correspondence from the Mesa Country extraction period, catalogued and accessible to researchers, and as far as can be determined from the published finding aids, unread in any study that has subsequently found its way into print. The Bureau of American Ethnology field notes describing Ute oral tradition about layered mesa terrain remain in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives in essentially the same condition. Rivera's journal recorded guides who would not camp near certain plateau edges in 1765. Escalante's journals observed the same practice 11 years later. Thomas Markel drove back to Durango in October of 1899 with a professional opinion about dressed limestone that he put into 2 letters. A professor in Golden never answered, and then carried in retirement to Farmington, where a cartographer with a notebook asked him about it once over a meal in 1916 and wrote down what he said. 3 separate threads, originating in 3 separate institutional contexts across more than a century, each describing the same Mesa country from a different distance and arriving at the same conclusion about what the ground there holds. None of them are in conversation with each other. None of them were ever formally brought together. What the 1899 survey produced was not a geological assessment. It was an encounter between a drill bit and something the Mesa had been sitting above for 7 centuries, something the Ute guides who accompanied Rivera had recognized and declined to explain in terms an expedition could act on, something a trained assayer looked at for a single morning and decided, with the particular clarity of a man who understood exactly what he had found, he was unwilling to put his professional initials beside. The Antiquities Act that might have protected the site, and that might have compelled the Bureau to notify an office with the mandate to investigate it, was 7 years away when Creighton filed his negative result and closed the file. The Mesa's surface presents nothing a passing observer would distinguish from any other plateau formation in the Dolores watershed. If Markel was right about those core samples, the limestone cap at 14 feet has been undisturbed for longer than the Bureau that classified the site as a negative result has existed. The boreholes Creighton sank have long since been filled by weather and time. The lower core samples are gone from the traceable record. The ceiling, if it is what Markel believed it to be, is still there. Flat, dressed, at 14 feet below the surface of a mesa the map has always shown as empty ground. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.